All right, for whatever reason lately, a lot of people have been posting online showing records with mispressed labels, and Zach Metzger in one of the groups posted one that was just ridiculous. It was worse than anything I've seen. And he was kind enough to send it to me, which I really appreciate. This is a Joe Walsh record, and when you pull it out of the sleeve, it actually seems fine. One side has the label perfectly pressed, it's centered and everything. But when you flip it over and look at the other side, you see that there's actually multiple labels on it. And in this case, there's quite a few. If you flip through here, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 labels on the B side. That's more than I'm used to seeing. And people keep wondering, or at least this is the comment that I see very often, is can you actually remove these labels? And I think I need to explain how these labels are attached. They're not glued on, as a lot of people seem to think. They're actually pressed right into the record itself. So the records start with this little biscuit of vinyl with a label being pressed on either side. So a label is placed onto one stamper, the vinyl biscuit between, and then another label on top, and then the other stamper, these metal stampers that have the master recording, the grooves cut right into it, are pressed into that vinyl. So I had this Sandy Denny and the Straubs record, which appears to have two labels, one right on top of the other, and I kind of wanted to test this theory out. So I think that the second label is the bubbled one, and the first label is pressed into the vinyl cleanly. So I decided to give this a shot. Took a screwdriver, rotated it through the spindle hole to remove the top label from the bottom label, and then peeled the top label off. And sure enough, there was another label underneath. And not only was there another label underneath, I actually didn't expect this, but it's a perfect label pressed into the record. So that bubbled one on top could simply be removed. And you can see on the back of this label, there's no glue holding this on. It's just a piece of paper. It's just the label itself without any adhesive. And the first label is actually pressed cleanly right to that soft vinyl disc that's being pressed in between the labels on the record. Anyway, Minimal Combinat posted one where the label actually tore as it was being squashed, and you can see a lot of these examples. There's an Alice in Chains one somebody sent me. Sometimes there's no label on one side and two labels on the other because one fell off and landed on the other side thanks to gravity. Anyway, there's tons of these out there. I don't know where many of these came from, so I apologize for not being able to accurately identify whose these are. But anyway, there's tons of examples out there. It's not super common, but it does happen. The weird thing is that not only do people wonder, can the label be removed and the record be played, which my argument would be no, but some people actually think they're worth something more. I would argue they're not worth anything more just because the labels are messed up. I mean, if my record cover was smashed, or it had a corner dings, or it had water damage, or anything like that, I would argue that the record is worth less and not worth very much because it's ruined. So same thing with the record. If it's scratched or warped or whatever, it doesn't make it worth any more. But yet, I suppose with something weird like the Beatles, where there are crazy collectors that will collect absolutely anything, I suppose there are some particular bands with crazy collectors and followers where people would pay, $200 for a messed up record. I don't know why. Like I said, I don't think misprints like this make them worth any more, or mispressings. But, maybe there's somebody out there that will pay $400 for a Beach Boys record. Whatever. I think that's insane. To me, they're not worth anything. Quick side note, oversized labels like on this Yukihiro Takahashi album don't make them worth any more either. Anyway, luckily, a kind person from No Name Vinyl Records sent me this Junior record, mispressed label. And one label's obviously right where it needs to be. It's in the center, goes right through the spindle, and is exactly what it's supposed to be. The other label, however, the extra label, obviously is in the way. I can't put the needle down and play the last two songs because obviously it would tear up the needle. in addition to simply not being able to play the song because the needle would skip and get grabbed by that label. So anyway, the question is, what's underneath that label? So I'm going to actually destroy this record in the process to show you that there shouldn't be anything underneath this second label. Or I should say there's not going to be clean grooves underneath this second label like the grooves of the vinyl. The dead wax here should be fine, but where the actual grooves start, it's not going to be any good. The stamper is going to give really clean grooves for the songs where the vinyl is. But if you look at the label itself really closely, you can actually see the tracks pressed into the paper. But the important thing to understand here is they're pressed into the paper. There might be a little bit of groove underneath the paper in the vinyl itself, but in essence, it's pressed into the paper. And Jack White with Third Man Records, he did this on purpose with a bunch of his. So Lazaretto has a secret track hidden on each side of the record, right in the label. He did it with the Dead Weather, a couple of different Dead Weather records. There's a bunch of these where you'll find hidden tracks pressed right directly in the label. It's fun and it's interesting, but they sound like crap. Not surprisingly. Obviously, Jack White would have known that they weren't going to sound great because paper is going to be fibrous and it's not going to be smooth like the vinyl is. So you put your needle down on these things and it's literally scratching against the paper. So it's going to sound like some old recording from 1919 or something like that. It's not going to sound great, but it's a fun trick. It's a fun gimmick. And you guys have probably seen these little videos before, but if a needle, rides through the grooves, I'm not going to go through the whole technology of magnets and all these weird things that it does to actually convert it to audio waves. But the paper is not going to play things smoothly like the vinyl would. And in the process of pressing these things, the label would be on top of the vinyl biscuit. It would get squashed in between two stampers. And as it's being squashed, the grooves would press into the label more than they would press into the record. So instead of having nice sharp ridges in the vinyl, they'd be rounded off and smoothed off from the paper. In fact, they'd even be flattened. So they're not going to be grooves that are actually very playable once the paper's removed. So that's the idea. So to prove the point, I decided, all right, I'll go ahead and take a vinyl record. I took the junior record that No Name Records sent me, and I went ahead and thought, all right, I'll save the one label, the one in the center, and then I'll remove the second label. And simple water and soap is not going to do the trick here, so I'm going to need something that's stronger. And because the label has, it's thick and has a smooth coating on top, I thought, well, I'll just really lightly sand it just to open up the fibers of the paper and make it easier for the chemicals to soak into the paper. So I'm not sanding this very hard. I'm literally just as lightly as I can just to break up the paper a little bit, because I don't want to actually get down to the grooves below the label when I'm sanding, of course. I went ahead and used some naphthol, which is kind of like a gasoline, actually. So I'm using a caustic solution to try to break up the paper a little bit. I used a short bristle brush and just kind of lightly scrubbed hard enough to try to remove the paper. Once it got wet, it became kind of like a paper pulp, and I could just gently scrape and try to remove as much of that paper pulp as I could. And you can't really use anything much more caustic than this, because anything more caustic is going to really start to damage the vinyl itself. In fact, just to prove the point, I went ahead and tried spraying some goof off on one side just to see what it would do to the vinyl. And it actually destroyed the vinyl even more than I expected it to. So if I scrub this goof off into it, I might be able to get the label off. But what this is also doing is actually melting the vinyl, so you can see it mixing in, and the black of the vinyl is actually becoming a paste and mixing with the goof off and ruining any of the grooves that were there. It just completely ruins it. It's way too caustic for something like this. So again, water and soap, not enough to remove these labels. Naphtha seems to work pretty well. But again, my argument is that it's not going to reveal good grooves. So it took a while to try to scrub this off without damaging the record underneath. I just kept putting on a little more chemicals, scrubbing a little more until I could finally start to see the vinyl below. The dead wax was actually a little rougher than the dead wax was in the rest of the record, but the spot where the grooves are, what you end up seeing is actually what I was describing before. Really smoothed out, not sharp or deeply cut grooves, because again, the grooves are actually being pressed into the paper itself. But I went ahead and removed it as much as possible. Obviously, I messed up the label. I really didn't care about keeping the first label good. But the grooves where the record is really don't look any better than the dead wax in the middle. And the ridge that's left on the edge from where the label was would actually just rip your needle to shreds if you tried to play this. So not only are there no grooves, the ridge would damage your needle. It's a mess. There's absolutely no way you can simply remove the label and suddenly have a playable record. That's not the way the pressing process works. So if you end up with one of these, it's a novelty. You can keep it for fun if you want. Personally, I don't think they're worth anything. But yeah, don't bother removing the label. It's not going to be worth anything, and it's not going to be playable anyway. But good luck if you've ended up with one. And congratulations, because they're kind of funky and weird.